Okay, wonderful. So what we're going to turn to next is we're going to think about how wages are determined in a labor market equilibrium when neither firms nor workers have market power, right? So when we're in a competitive market equilibrium, we're going to think about how various strategies to improve wages would play out in a competitive market equilibrium. And then we're going to think about how both of those things are going to change when firms have some ability to set wages. In other words, when firms have market power as buyers, as consumers of labor, rather than having market power as sellers of products. Wonderful. So to do this, let's think about some really, really simple supply and demand curves. Let's say we're thinking about, let's say the market for restaurant workers in Highland Park. We'll say that we've got a labor supply equal to 10W, a labor demand equal to something like 270 minus 20W. Right, so if we graph this thing, we'll have labor supply upward sloping, right? Labor demand is downward sloping. Right? At a wage of 0, we'd hire 270 people. Right? At a wage of $13.50, 270 over 20, we wouldn't hire anyone. And so if we want to find our labor market equilibrium, all we have to do, right, is to set supply equal to demand. So we'll say 10W equals 270 minus 20W, right? W is going to equal 270 over 30, which is going to equal $9 an hour, right? And that'll mean that our number of labor hours will be either our supply or demand curve will work. 10 times 9 is going to be 90, right? So in a market equilibrium, we'll have 90 labor hours, and we'll have those work at a wage of $9 an hour. Wonderful, right? So far, nothing fancy. So a couple things to point out about this solution. So the first is, right, just like with any other market we talk about, the competitive equilibrium is going to be economically efficient. And the reason that's true, the reason we can see this, is because at each point in our labor supply curve, right, the wage is going to tell us the amount of money it takes to get a worker to give up their next hour of leisure, right? So what this means is that the 90th hour worked as leisure has a value of $9 to the worker working it. And the labor demand curve, right, is going to tell us our marginal revenue product from firms. So the fact that the 90th hour worked, firms are willing to pay $9 an hour, means that the output produced by that hour of work is worth $9, right? So by having 90 hours worked, we've had every hour worked that produces stuff that's more valuable to consumers than the time it takes to produce it is worth to workers, right? If anyone worked any more, then that time would be more valuable as leisure to the worker than it would be as products to the consumer. Wonderful. Okay, so this is an economically efficient outcome. However, you might argue that it's kind of a sucky outcome, right? $9 an hour is a really bad wage. So we might want to think about what can we do to increase the earnings of workers in a competitive market equilibrium like this one. So one possibility, what if we subsidized wages? In particular, let's imagine that we wanted to encourage employers, right, to hire workers. So we'll pay an employer $3 per hour for the hours that they hire their workers, right? Let's imagine. So if we do this, let's think about how demand for labor is going to change. Well, our labor demand is telling us our marginal revenue product, right? In other words, when we say that at 90 hours worked, we'd be willing to pay $9 an hour, what this is telling us is that the 90th worker is producing $9 worth of stuff. So if that worker is producing $9 worth of stuff, and we're getting $3 an hour from the government as an employer, we'd be willing to pay that person up to $12 an hour to work for us, right? Because on top of the stuff they're actually producing for us, they're giving us an additional $3. We're getting from the government an additional $3 an hour of incentive. In In other words, another way to think about this is that the wage I actually have to pay my workers is no longer W, it's W minus the portion the government's going to pay, right? W minus 3. So my new labor demand, is going to be 270 minus 20 times W minus 3. Right? So this will be 270 minus 20W minus or plus 60, right, is 330 minus 20W. So now, when I set labor supply equal to labor demand, right, what's this going to look like? It's going to look like a curve that's $3 an hour higher at every point. So what's my new labor market equilibrium going to be? Well, I'll set labor supply equal to labor demand. Right, so I'll say 10W equals 330 minus 20W. Right, this is going to tell me 30W equals 330. W is going to equal $11 an hour. In other words, by subsidizing low-wage workers, I was successful in increasing the wages of workers. However, I wasn't able to give them $1 for each dollar of subsidy, right? For each $3 of subsidy, $2 is going to the workers, $1 is going to the firm, right? Now, on top of that, we're also then going to ask, well, how much employment is there going to be in equilibrium? The answer is going to be, right, that at $11 an hour, we're going to have 10 times 11 equals 110 hours worked. Right? So what this means is we've increased the level of employment via this subsidy, right? We've increased wages by $2 an hour. We've also induced 20 more hours of work. Now, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? In many respects, this extra work is actually a disadvantage. It's a bad thing. It's a negative consequence of this policy. And the reason for that is, if we think about what our labor supply curve and our labor demand curve represents, right? This worker, this 110th labor hour worked, is not worth $11 to the firm, right? It's not producing $11 worth of output. It's producing $8 worth of output, right? The firm is willing to pay $11 because they're getting $3 back. So they're only actually paying $8 because they're only actually getting $8 worth of value from that last hour worked. On the other hand, the value to the employee, the value to the worker of that leisure hour that they're giving up is equal to $11, right? That's why their labor supply curve is there. So spending that time with their family or going to a party or watching a movie would be worth $11 to the worker. The stuff that worker is producing is only worth $8 to a consumer. So as a consequence of this subsidy, we're going to end up with a deadweight loss, right? A deadweight loss that's a consequence of too many hours worked. And this is a real problem. This is a real potential problem. It's actually something I'm doing research on right now, is trying to understand whether the earned income tax credit, which subsidizes low-wage labor, encourages more hours of work, is economically efficient, or whether it encourages too much work for families with children. One last thing I want to mention about this, you might think, well, why did we give the subsidy to the employer? Why didn't we give the subsidy to the employee? And the answer is, it would not have fundamentally affected what would happen in this market. If we'd given the subsidy to the employee, right, so if we'd said, you're now, instead of earning W, you're going to earn W plus 3, then we would have said that our labor supply would become 10 times W plus 3, right? We would have shifted our labor supply out by $3 an hour. We would have ended up at the exact same equilibrium, right? So who's actually getting the subsidy paid by the government does not affect who ends up getting the subsidy in their pocket. Instead, that's going to be affected by the relative elasticity of supply and of demand. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So what's the punchline? The punchline is that in a competitive market, right, subsidizing workers' wages is going to be an effective tool for increasing their wages, but we're not going to get $1 of increased wage for each dollar of subsidy, right? Some of that subsidy is going to go to employers, and we're going to generate deadweight losses by increasing employment beyond its efficient level in the economy, right? So we'll have some people will be basically encouraging some people to work whose time would actually be better spent doing something else, right? Whether that's relaxing, taking care of children, taking care of elders, etc. So if we wanted higher wages, but we weren't willing to accept the negative consequences of a wage subsidy, right? We don't want to accept people working more hours than is economically efficient, and we don't want some of our subsidy to go to employers rather than workers. Another alternative would be to impose a minimum wage, right? So for example, we might say instead of allowing the market to set a wage of 9, we might say that no one's allowed to pay a wage below 12, right? $12 an hour. And of course, as we can see on this graph, as you've seen before, this is going to have a couple effects. It's going to raise wages, of course, but it's also going to reduce the number of labor hours that employers want to hire, increase the number of labor hours workers want to work, right? People are going to be willing to work more hours at a wage of $12 an hour than at a wage of $9 an hour. Employers are going to be willing to hire fewer people at a wage of $12 an hour than a wage of $9 an hour. So what are those differences going to be? Our labor demand at $12 an hour is going to be 270 minus 20 times 12, which is going to be 30 hours. Right? Our labor supply is going to be 10 times 12 is going to be 120 hours. So instead of having this problem of inefficiently high levels of work, right, we're going to have a problem of inefficiently low levels of work. And the reason for that is essentially that between 30 and 90 hours, right, we have employees whose time is worth less to them than the stuff that they're producing is worth to their consumers, right? In other words, the person, let's say the 60th hour of work, right, the value of that leisure hour would be, oh my goodness, that 60th hour, right, as leisure is worth about $6 to the worker, but the stuff they produce would be worth about, let's see, 270 minus 60 is 210 over 20, so that would be about 1050 to the consumers, right, to their employer. So the point here is, we've got this triangle of loss here that represents essentially hours that are worth less to the workers than they would have been worth in terms of the value of their output to consumers. Right. Now, how big of a deal is this? How serious is this deadweight loss going to be? Is going to depend entirely on how steep the labor demand curve is. We're going to have a very, very inelastic demand for labor. We're going to have a very, very small deadweight loss because we'll have few employees lose their jobs. We'll have very few people whose labor is worth $12 an hour but not worth $9 an hour. We have a very, very elastic demand for labor. The opposite will be true. We'll have lots of job loss. Another important point here, though, is that if we draw this triangle of deadweight loss, what we have to assume is that the people who remain employed are going to be the people who have the highest value of employment, right? Whose leisure hours have the lowest value to them, right? Down to $3 an hour. But we actually have all of these extra people who are willing to work. So another thing we might worry about is that a minimum wage might increase employment among people whose time is worth more than $9 an hour to them, and decrease employment among people whose time is worth less than $9 an hour to them. Right? In other words, we might worry about something like a high minimum wage, increasing employment for, let's say, middle-class teenagers during summer break, and reducing employment for people who are recently out of prison or recently homeless, or in other ways, more difficult to employ. Okay, so what's the big picture here? What's the end game here? Essentially what we're going to say is that we are able to increase wages from a competitive labor market equilibrium. In many circumstances, that's going to be a valuable or worthwhile policy to pursue if we're worried about reducing inequality, but it'll have economic efficiency costs. So what I'm going to do next is reanalyze these two policies, but without this assumption that labor markets are perfectly competitive. In other words, we're going to think about how this story changes if employers are able to set wages themselves.